Hey everyone. Before we get into today's episode, we want to just take a moment to address the June 24th, 2022 Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. This decision stripped away the right to have a safe and legal abortion. To be clear, we here at Debate This believe that everyone should have the freedom to decide what's best for themselves and their families, including when it comes to ending a pregnancy. This decision has dire consequences for individual health and safety and could have harsh repercussions for other landmark decisions. Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health and independence of all Americans. Learn more by visiting podvoices.help. Again, that's podvoices.help. And if you're able to support others, please consider donating to abortion funds. We've put a bunch of links in the show notes, so please go ahead and check that out. We encourage you to speak up, take care, and spread the word.
Matt, did you want to talk about Black Widow's feet?
Well, I'm going to talk about eco-terrorism.
Got too excited about jorts.
I am leaving now with my Roomba or your blood on my hands.
I'm back on my bullshit.
What is meme if not air horn persevering?
No, this is not a family show.
And I quote, many American titties.
Why'd you have to bring Dane Cook to this, Andrew? No one wanted that.
Oh, you guys are not ready for what I've got today.
And I've apparently hit the very end of my attention span.
Give me like 30 seconds, I'm looking for rhymes.
Hello, and welcome to Debate This, the show where no one is right, but someone is definitely wrong. In this show, we take time out of our busy adult lives to talk about comic books, video games, and how Midnight Sun getting a major console game, but being a card battler, feels like Matt made a wish on a monkey's paw.
I'm so angry.
It's my favorite thing that's ever happened.
You know, that might be my favorite opening that we've ever recorded just because of the truth behind it.
God, I am spitting mad about that game.
So if you listening out there have not been following the news on the new Midnight Suns game, Midnight Suns is the like Avengers for Ghost Rider, and Matt has been talking about on our other show, Avenge This, Midnight Suns for the entirety of Avenge This.
Forever.
Yeah.
And it was finally announced that Midnight Suns is getting a cool game that's probably going to be on Switch, but it's a very crunchy strategic RPG.
Which I could not possibly be less interested in playing. Like, they released a gameplay trailer this week to just complete the arc. If you haven't listened to this podcast before, they released a gameplay trailer this week, and they had announced this game about a year ago, and that it was being made by the developers who did XCOM and XCOM 2. And everybody in our Discord was like, hey, Matt, you're not going to like this game because you wouldn't like XCOM. And I was like, all right, fair, but I still want to play this game. And so this gameplay trailer came out, and I was like, well, I'll just watch the trailer, and I'll see how bad I'm going to have to white-knuckle my way through this game just so I can beat up baddies with Ghost Rider and Nico Minoru.
Hang out with your
beat
best
up
friends.
Lilin. Yeah, and boy, I watched that gameplay trailer and I couldn't do it. I couldn't even make it the whole way through the trailer. I can't.
And the kicker here is, too, it's not just a card battler. There's an RPG relationship building element with the heroes of the game.
It is a who's who of Matt's least favorite cliches all bundled together.
Least favorite
also, side note, that game looks great. I'm very excited.
I'm really excited.
Very excited for this game.
Matt watching the trailer is like that TikTok or that gif of that woman drinking LaCroix where she's like, is it good? No. Well, wait. And then at the end goes, no. All right, no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was exactly
I was going to say it's too many slices.
The moment that got me in the trailer, if you were curious, was when they said, each battle begins with a random selection of cards from your deck. And I was like, no. I'm out. I'm out.
If you want to make Kyle immediately hard, those are the words to do it.
If this game came out tomorrow, we would not be, or this game was out, we would not be playing this or recording this right now.
If Midnight Suns has one fan, Kyle is one of them.
Kyle is it. If Midnight Suns has 0 fans, it's because I am dead. So some amount of time ago, Todd and I teamed up to discuss social justice in comic books. And since no one ran us out of town, so patron and friend of the pod, Sharkbait, commissioned us to follow that episode up with one exploring the history of gender in comics, which he is able to do as a $25 member of #ButtThumpNation. If you'd like to commission your own flavor text, you can do so by joining us at patreon.com/debatethis and holding that Master Debater membership for 3 months.
Hey, that's really good.
Yeah, side note real quick. Do you all remember those like late 90s commercials on TV when they would run the disclaimer that quick or faster at the end?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. They don't do that anymore, do they? They just
have a minute-long ad.
Usually the font's like 3-point font at the bottom, and it's like, also, this medicine might kill you, but first. And you're like, oh, I don't know.
The ad is literally like, try extra gel, and then doesn't tell you what it does, but spends the next 60 seconds listing out all the side effects you might suffer from. It's real bad.
I mean, it sounds like extra gel could have some good side effects, so I don't know.
It might. So this is a hefty topic, and not without its potential missteps for this straight white man to make. So to help me avoid falling down these pitfalls, or to fall down them with me, are Todd Fridging Thomas, Andrew accidentally misgendering your character in an attempt to be progressive Henderson, and Matt, screw it, they're a lesbian now, Cole.
Do you guys think that if I chanted cishet squad enough, it'd become a thing?
No. I do think it would become a thing. I don't think you want it to become the thing it would become.
What if I did it ironically? Is that any better?
See, but the problem is the people chanting unironically are only going to see you chanting ironically.
That's true.
Yep.
That's a good point. I need to stop doing things ironically, you guys.
Right.
Yeah, that defines the 2010s and sent us down some bad roads.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so today on this podcast, we are going to attempt to pull back a bit of the curtain on the demographics of the readers and representation of different genders and gender expression in comics through the industry's long history. We want to acknowledge that this is an industry that has been dominated by heteronormative cis white men for most of its history, and while it has grown more inclusive over the last decade or so, it is still far from perfect and has a long way to go. We are also going to mostly be covering the, quote, big two, Marvel and DC, because of the weight they carry in the industry and the collective zeitgeist, and if we don't limit it to just the big two, this would be a series and a whole podcast, not just a hopefully less than 2-hour episode of one podcast. Also, because of the culture we're in, a bulk of this is going to mostly just be about the history of women and their representation in comics, but we will get to non-binary and trans expression in comics towards the end as well. Not because they're any less important, but just because of the amount there is to talk about. So to kick us off, Todd has brought some stats and information on the demographic of readers of the big two comics throughout its history. What do you got, Todd?
Hey, did you all come here today to listen to statistics? Because I've got statistics in a podcast form. So just some fun things here, because we're going to talk about representation. We need to talk about who is reading, or at least who was reading comics and who's apparently, per survey data, reading them today. And so what was fun was when I was kind of doing some of this research, I found what I believe was a student's senior capstone reader paper from 2009.
Hell yeah.
Titled, yeah, man, this is awesome. The Golden Age of Comic Books, Representations of American Culture from the Great Depression to the Cold War. So Mark Kelly of Marquette University in 2009, if you're listening to this podcast, I am going to cite your paper in our podcast and our show notes. So we'll start in that late 30s, early 50s era. So I know Kyle will probably talk about it later, the golden age of comic books. We talk about the golden age a lot. Just to kind of give you the brief TLDR to get this started, the golden age was that time of late 30s, early 50s. We're talking towards the end of the Great Depression. We're talking World War II.
It's it's comics moving away from individual comic strips into comic books. That's kind of the start.
Mhm.
And then up till pretty much the inaction of the Comics Code Authority is the golden
Absolutely.
age of comics.
The good times, as it
the,
were.
the good times.
Yeah.
This is when they
The-
were good. They were goodish. Then they got bad. Then they got good again.
The Roaring 20s, if
You
were.
will.
If you
Well,
will.
so this is where we saw the birth of just your big heroes. So Captain America, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. And then we saw a lot of other heroes that also kind of ended up being big or not so big, depending on how you look at them. So we saw Shazam, who at the time was named Captain Marvel, Dr. Fate, Green Arrow, Aquaman, Namor the Submariner, Human Torch, but like the android Human Torch of Marvel, not the Chris Evans, Michael B. Jordan Human Torch that we got with the Fantastic Four.
Not Johnny Storm.
Not Johnny Storm, if you're
No.
going to call him by his
He
name.
said Michael B. Jordan. Everybody knows Michael B. Jordan was Johnny Storm.
This is also the time when we first started seeing the emergence of heroes punching Hitler, which is
My
my-
favorite.
oh man, I've shared the listicle so many times.
That would be a really good like documentary title.
Yeah.
Like
Heroes
punching
Hitler?
Hitler. A look at the comics golden age.
Yeah, that
So-
rips.
We do not have an Imgur link for this, but for those of you who are subscribed to the Patreon to have access to our show notes, I've cited a number of my sources in here, including the link to the listicle of heroes punching Hitler. Honorable mention of those heroes, just for fun context here. The DC hero Adam, who is fighting Jetpack Hitler, which is Hitler with a jetpack.
Worse than regular Hitler.
Well, that's
But not as bad as Mecha Hitler.
well, speaking of Raphael from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fighting Robot Hitler, that happened in the 90s, but okay.
Good.
But probably what's most important here to address is that the image of Steve Rogers, Captain America, punching Hitler actually debuted a year before the US even entered war. Like we had not yet officially entered World War II. And Jack Kirby and the rest of them like put this out, and they were like, "Yeah, we'll do this.
Yeah.
This feels good."
Yeah. I mean, Marvel at the time was run by predominantly Jewish men, I believe.
Yeah.
Yep. And everything that I read was sharing how, or at least a number of the things that I read was sharing how like they were getting hate for this. Like they were like Marvel Comics were catching heat for taking these strong stances, which like
America
for
was
punching
really
Hitler.
anti-Semitic until they learned about the Holocaust. And then they were like, "Ooh, maybe that's bad." And
then for a short time thereafter, they weren't anti-Semitic anymore. And then in recent years,
they became more.
Yeah.
Do you guys notice how just fancy Bucky looks in this cover?
So let's talk about Bucky real quick. So the reason why I share all this is context, right? Like this is setting the stage for who is reading comics. The other thing that kind of emerged after all of these heroes started getting off the ground were sidekicks. And if you notice, a lot of the sidekicks, your Buckys, your Robins, they're kids. And that was to appeal to the youths, to get them engaged in reading comic books. So,
the kids that were reading it, it was their self-insert character.
So when we look in the mid 40s, the data that I could find was that there was a study done in the mid 1940s that stated 70 million Americans, which was like half the population at the time, were reading comic books. Which, like, what is one thing half the nation does now except hate the other half of the nation?
It's not
like,
read.
Yeah, it's certainly not read.
It doesn't involve much.
No. And breaking that down further, it was a pretty high percentage of both reported boys and girls. So 95% of boys 6 to 11 and 91% of, self-reported girls 6 to 11. And then 41% of men ages 18 to 30 and 28% of women. So like a hefty amount of society.
That ties in. I could get into it a little bit, but in the start of the Silver Era in 1961, the second most popular comic was a romance series. It was not a superhero series at all. It was something similar to like the Archie comics was the second most read comic. So interesting.
And there was another study that came out a couple years later showing that, as the years went on, readers, these kids that were reading comics were getting older, and that half of all comic book readers were over the age of 20. So like this population of kids in like the 40s grow up and keep reading comic books, which is going to see a kind of a through line that you'll see here. And again, all this is context, because these numbers aren't a surprise that comics were this like cultural staple due to everything taking place, which, war and patriotism, and then bad imagery, which goes with both the war and the patriotism that we've discussed in a prior episode of this.
Yeah.
The one thing that I thought was also neat is that even President Roosevelt made a remark that applies to what we're talking about and why all these people were reading. And that was, quote, it was like, this is in the mid-30s. So, quote, "When the spirit of the people is lower than at any other time during this depression, it is a splendid thing for the just 15 cents an American can go to a movie and forget his troubles." So apply that same logic to a comic book, because in the mid-30s, comic books were 10 cents, which is about $2 now.
Wow.
So it was a
third
cheap
the price
escape.
they are today. They're like $6.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, not to talk too much about the Comic Code Authority, but following all this, we get to the 50s and the Comic Code Authority era, which, if you didn't listen to our last podcast, basically one man argued that comics rot people's brains, poison our kids' brains, and then a bunch of old white lawmakers wanted to solve it through armchair legislation.
Which always works.
Always works.
Yeah. Well, and the reason why I bring it up is because at that point, we see this like massive drop in readership. So over the span of a few years, the number of comic book titles being published drops by a little bit more than a half. So it was like 600 titles a year, dropped down to 250, and sales overall cut in half. So readership just went down. Now, following that, when we get to the 60s and 70s, as society relaxed from those regulations, people started reading comics again. Because those kids that grew up consuming comic books were now consuming drugs. And
So do you have a source on that?
I did not cite that, but that is what I believe.
I do want to note and give Todd the credit that all of his citations here do follow MLA format. If anybody was curious, they do. It checks out.
I use my degree exclusively for this podcast. So that is kind of the where we've been. So where we are now, I found a study that was from 2017 that a person named Kristen McLean presented at the New York Comic Con to kind of break down some more statistics. And so currently, and this is again like 5 years old, 6% of Americans are reading comics. So, and those are Americans aged 18 to 34. Of that, 63% are purchased by reported men, 37% by reporting women, and then 57% of comic buyers are between the ages of 13 to 29. So it's back to being like a younger person's, game. Some other fun statistics. I had some. Here we go. So comics and graphic novel buying individuals. So 69% are reporting non-Hispanic white, 12% Latino, 10% African American, and 8% Asian. And that is just overall comic purchasing. Comic shoppers are also likely to have some college education, 85%, which tracks with data in those initial things that I had shared in like the 30s. I think it was closer to like 40%, but the largest percentage has always been people who have some amount of college education.
Huh. Sure. Which, like, when you think about it, makes sense, because usually comics are pretty historically like liberal leaning, like very left leaning.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure a lot of that has to just do with like general media consumption as well.
Also, probably
because
that.
I think the more educated a person is, the more media they tend to seek out. And I don't have a source on that, so I don't want to like stamp my foot in the ground. But I think just general media consumption, I would guess, goes up at some sort of positive correlation to education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also a positive correlation with artistic people and enjoying art.
More
for
art.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just some other fun statistics too from this, which again I'll cite this in our notes. It's fun that people who are buying graphic novels for superheroes largely skew male. That's 78%, whereas people who buy manga are a pretty even split. It's like 56 to 44.
Yeah.
Manga buyers are also typically younger. And where was this last bit? Oh, so what also is interesting, women are more likely to buy non-superhero graphic novels as they get older, whereas the largest amount of reporting women who are consuming superhero stories are younger, which I think probably plays into some of the rise of more female superhero leads, which I think is pretty interesting.
Definitely.
There was one last statistic that I thought was really fun here. So this is largely just reporting. I mean, at least the data that I just shared now is like not just America, but some worldwide fun information. In 2016, 25% of all printed materials in Japan came from the manga industry, which is kind of wild the more you think about that.
Yeah, that is pretty wild.
All
1/4 of all printed media.
What years were this?
That was 2016.
Well, to be fair, probably 1/4 of that is One Piece. So they're skewing the numbers a little bit.
Yeah, there's a number there. I found another study that started dipping into manga, like in France in 2018. France sold 38% of all manga in 2018, which
wow.
France
That's
over there
way higher than I would expect France
over there getting weird.
I'm gonna start spreading the rumors that France loves Goku.
I mean,
what did we just say about saying things ironically, Andrew?
Damn it! I didn't make it 10 minutes.
But yeah, I think the biggest takeaway here is obviously when we talk about the golden age, like that's when comic books were having their heyday. Printed purchasing is still a major part of the comic experience. I mean, you still see those stores that are around now. Obviously, there are different models with Marvel Unlimited. But, you know, the biggest thing I would say is that the largest consumers are probably not that, whatever I said, the 6 to 13 age, or that first age that I quoted.
Oh, yeah.
6 to 11. Mm-hmm. That's probably not the biggest consumer anymore. The biggest consumer is skewing a little bit older. But, you know, all those 6 to 11-year-olds grew up and had kids and said, hey, I loved growing up reading comic books. You should read comic books now, too.
Something I found when we get hit about the late 80s, early 90s, is we get into the collectible aspect of comics really drives sales at that point. So I wouldn't be surprised if today a bulk of actual new comic purchases are by whales who buy a lot of comics as they come out and may not necessarily make up readership, but keep the industry afloat, just buying variant covers and new issues just in case, you know, the next Wolverine comes out of a new comic today. They want to have those ready to go.
Well, and I wonder how it shows up with, you know, like you said, these whales that are buying up these huge blocks of comics when they then turn them around through a comic book store. Yeah. Because I'm just thinking of Andrew and I were at a comic book store in Canton not that long ago, and a man like walked us through his collection, and he's like, that there is 10,000 comic books that I need to sort and categorize. Like, is he a data point? Is his store a data point? Is it both?
Yeah,
because based upon that, there's a significant percent of comic book buyers who are this man.
I mean, that's how companies will define sales. Like, they're selling to wholesalers, right? Like, that's the sales.
Yeah. All right. Anything else to wrap up, Todd? Or you?
No, that's what I got you for statistics. The the kids were reading, and kids don't read books anymore.
Those dang kids. Don't want to
Dang
work,
kids.
don't want to read books anymore.
They're hanging out all day with their iPods and their Mortal Kombat.
It's me. I'm kids.
I swear to God, Andrew, I thought you were gonna say they're hanging out with their iPods and their Morbiuses.
And they're
No.
Morbii. It's Morbii now.
Stop it. No.
We really need to stop with that.
Hey, remember what we said about not doing things ironically?
I do.
Here we are doing things ironically. Okay, so moving on from Todd's great collection of stats, I'm going to kind of walk us through a quick history of women in comics. I know this is the topic.
Kyle
here is-
presents a quick history of women.
A quick history of women. I know the topic is like gender in comics. I think we all can see with our very functional eyes how men are represented in comics, and like we don't.
We get it. We don't have to cover that side of it.
A lot of it is wrapped up in like male power fantasy, and that's about it. There's men's representation in comics. So we'll spend a little time on women's representation in comics, and then we'll take a quick break and come back to cover trans and non-binary representation in comics as well. So I will, like Todd, take us back to the beginning, because it's a very good place to start, and talk about the golden age of comics again. So as I said before, the golden age of comics is considered the period of time from comic strips evolving past single strip vignettes into short stories or comic books, and ends about the time of the Comics Code Authority takes place. So generally from the 1930s to the end of the 1950s. In the beginning, at this time, comic books were not entirely dominated by superhero stories, but had things like there were very popular romance comic books and like teen slice of life comics as well. Think like your Archie comics. That was a very popular style of comics. So the representation of women in the romance and kind of slice of life comics was a tad better than the superhero side. It was still very like traditional gender norms of the time, but like there were women characters doing things and like talking about stuff other than men passing the Bechdel test and all that. So it was a decent time, even if you think about how old it was. However, in superhero comics of the time, women were typically secondary characters or quote unquote love interests, in parentheses, trophies to be won by men when they beat the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So these women were typically like career-minded women, and through World War II, we did see women in more job roles than previously or prior to, as that's what women were doing in real life. They were going to work in factories and offices and banks. So comics of the time reflected that. And this kind of ties back to what Todd was saying, where like readership was more on an even keel, where like men and women at the time both sort of equally read comics. So that is reflected in the stories they told. There were the books and characters aimed at women were titles like Nellie the Nurse, Tessie the Typist, and Millie the Model. So not super great. If you scroll down a bit, I have a picture of a cover of Millie the Model a little later in the notes. And from what I saw of these, if you guys are familiar at all with the Kathy comic strips, that's about the level of writing these like female-focused comics
Awesome.
had. Where like
Great.
Millie the Model would come into frame like, I just got back from the salon, and her friend would say, well, you should go back to the salon and tell him to give you a refund. Yuck, 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 yuck. And like that was the
classic comedy.
Yeah, that's the extent. It was just gals being gals, written by white men.
Of course.
So this is around the time the Archie comics began, where we see like two very main characters, Betty and Veronica, and every appearance they were competing for the attention of a man, specifically
Gross.
Archie. The two would then later get their own spin-off comic where they would continue to vie for the attention of Archie and other male characters. Betty and Veronica are kind of a good representation of the two female archetypes that persisted at this time, with Betty being kind of the sweet, demure, quote-unquote, good girl, and Veronica being the more forward and confrontational, quote-unquote, bad girl. The blonde and the brunette, as represented in any media source from the 50s. In 1941, we get Wonder Woman, our first long-standing female superhero. We did have other female heroes at this time with characters like the Invisible Scarlet O'Neill, Phantoma, and Sheena, Queen of the Jungle.
Sheena looks rad.
Yeah,
Sheena
is like next under Wonder Woman as far as like longevity and like pretty decent in its representation.
Yeah.
I've got a quote here from Trina Robbins, who wrote the book The Great Women Superheroes. Most of Fiction House's pulp style action stories, Fiction House being one of the major comic book publishers at the time, either starred or featured strong, beautiful, competent heroines. They were war nurses, aviatrixes, girl detectives, counter spies, and animal skin clad jungle queens. They were in command. Guns blazing, daggers unsheathed, sword in hand, they leapt across the pages ready to take on any villain, and they did not need rescuing.
What you don't see here is Sheena is like 11 feet tall.
Yeah.
I just don't say it.
Yeah, Sheena is the Amazonian queen trope for sure.
Some real step on me energy coming out of the 1960s.
That's right.
1950s.
They were just ahead.
still
Yeah,
in the
this was
50s.
golden
Ahead of
age.
the curve,
Sorry,
that's it.
1950s.
Lady Sheena Trescu.
That was really good, Andrew.
Thanks.
So Wonder Woman obviously is the most enduring female hero character from this era, most recently having two blockbuster movie releases in 2017 and 2020. Wonder Woman was created by William Moulton Marston and his wife, Elizabeth Hallowey, after Elizabeth Hallowey pointed out to her husband that Superman and Batman and Green Lantern dominated the sales. Why can't a woman hero be on the same keel as them? And he was like, good point, dear. And they went to what was DC Comics at the time and pitched Wonder Woman. So Wonder Woman, for its time, was actually pretty progressive in some ways. The Amazons were shown to be, they were created by the goddess Aphrodite to be stronger and wiser than men, and they like frequently showed these Amazon women like outsmarting men, besting men in physical feats. However, the comic is not without its problems. The early issues of Wonder Woman attempted commentary on women's suffrage, using Wonder Woman's bracers as sort of a metaphor for the systemic oppression of women at the time. And you ran into stories and things like, if Wonder Woman's bracers were bound by a chain, or later her golden lasso, she loses all her powers and became, quote, as weak as a normal woman. If the bracers were...
Oh,
No.
that's
Yeah.
how they went with that.
Yeah. If the bracers were removed, she would lose control of her emotions and fly into violent mood swings and irrational actions,
Awesome.
trying to make this claim that like, but we must keep an eye on our women still. They can't be fully independent, or they'll. Yeah, it's still the 40s
Man,
and 50s.
That was so close. They were so close.
Well,
and then
Yeah.
And
they're
that's
like, she's hysterical.
that's what I thought too when Cal was like, oh, they're a metaphor for systematic oppression. I'm like, okay, go on.
Yeah.
Wait
Yeah,
for it.
too far,
And
too
then-
far.
Nope,
Yeah.
that's enough slices.
However, the stories of this time did see Diana Prince, Wonder Woman's alter ego, and Wonder Woman in roles such as there's a whole story where she was the president of the United States, and she was a modern day Incan priestess, goddess, which, you know, that has its own racial implications that aren't great, but was like a high role for a woman to hold at the time of being like this high religious figure. So as we moved ahead in time, as the character was handed off to other writers, as we go through like the Silver and Bronze Age of comics, they diminished her powers and had Diana Prince fall into more traditional roles for women at the time. Some of which being Diana Prince had a long stretch where she was a babysitter as her alter ego career.
Wow.
And as a fashion model as her alter ego career as well.
Great.
Things that women do.
Things women do, guys, right? And then one issue even has like Diana Prince give a whole internal thought monologue talking about a new mother and how she envies that woman's life as a mother and wife and wishes to give up her role as Wonder Woman, Amazonian princess.
As a literal god.
As a literal god, like creation of the gods to fight crime, to be a mother and wife. So
if only I could bone Chris Pine.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've all said that. So
yeah, I mean, like I would give up God status
us?
for that, but you know,
here's what gets me is like I realize we're talking about things that happened in the past. Like a number of the things we're going to talk about whenever we have discussions like these are like, well, these are in the past and things have gotten, and then the next word is either somewhat better, much better, way better, hopefully better soon. But like when I read these things and hear about these things, I'm just like, who was like stamp of approval, put it out the door.
Yeah.
Like I just imagine this like devilish overweight white dude with a cigar in his mouth who's like, yeah, this is what women will consume, this type of media. And like, who allowed this? Like, it's just so incredible.
I mean, you know the answer, but it's kind of like when you look at anything in American history where you're like, oh, well, it's going to get better. It's going to get better.
It's going to get better, it's the Anakin meme.
It's the Hayden Christensen, like, but it's going to get better.
Right?
So as I said earlier, the end of the golden age of comics is typically marked by the Comic Code Authority coming into place, which saw a even further reduction of
the literal fun police.
The literal fun police, which saw even more power reduction from Wonder Woman, a removal of just other female characters' stories entirely, and part of that is like written in the Comics Code Authority was that they did not want female characters to be on an even plane as the male characters, like flat out written into the verbiage of the act or whatever. It was like, it is contributing to juvenile delinquency to have women equal to men in these stories. And I have a quote here from Friedrich Wertham, who wrote a book that heavily influenced the Comics Code Authority, where he says, they are not they being the women they're talking about in these stories, they are not homemakers. They do not bring up a family. Mother love is entirely absent. Even when Wonder Woman adopts a girl, there are lesbian overtones, just like really casting shade on any portrayal of women as anything other than a mother or wife.
I'm gonna go out on a limb. I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess. You don't have to tell me that I'm right because I know I'm right. I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess that this man talked a lot about Jesus.
Yeah,
in his day,
a whole lot about Jesus.
So, and again, just in case you want more to look up, that book was called "Seduction of the Innocent."
Yeah,
and it was effectively the like video games create violent kids argument only 70 years ago.
Yeah, I mean it's an argument that every generation has had.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I don't understand this new media, therefore it's ruining our children and families and should be removed entirely. So from there we move into the Silver Age of comics. This starts in the early 60s. We've got the Comics Code Authority in full swing, and female representation in comics takes a regressive turn, let's say. DC literally had its in-house editorial policy stating the inclusion of females in stories is specifically discouraged. Women, when used in plot structures, should be secondary in importance and should be drawn realistically, without exaggeration of feminine physical qualities. They wanted very plain women in their stories.
Since we just got done talking mostly about the Comics Code Authority, it's probably a good point to make here as well. We say it in the show every now and again. Comics Code Authority was the thing that started you don't show divorce in comics. Yeah. So like the reason why you'll have single parents is not because there was ever a divorce, it's because someone died. Yeah. A parent died, because you don't see divorces can't happen.
Yeah. For anybody else like me who is curious what year we're talking about on the Wikipedia age for Silver Age, it says 1956. 1956 started the Silver Age of comics.
Okay.
Yep, that sounds right.
Yeah.
So despite DC having some of these policies, authors did try to sneak as much progressive representation of women through the censors as they could. A quick reminder that when I say progressive, I mean progressive in the face of the restrictions they had to operate under. These portrayals were not really even that progressive for the time. There was other more progressive media, but to the white men in power setting these rules, these examples would be considered progressive, and the authors did their best to like fight to keep those in. So
yeah, it's like when somebody dies in a Disney Plus show. It's not a big deal, but it's a big deal in context.
Yeah. So in addition to having like Lois Lane being Clark Kent's career rival, other superheroes from this time had women in these positions of power, like over the secret identities of the male characters. So like they weren't fighting crime with Superman, but like Lois Lane was always there to take Clark Kent down a few pegs. Vicky Vale, the reporter, would call out Bruce Wayne on his like millionaire playboy shenanigans. Mm-hmm. The Ray Palmer, the Atom, had a girlfriend, Jean Loring, who was a lawyer, and would, they would work together on like the law part of the crime fighting they would do. Hal Jordan answered to Carol Ferris, an aeronautics executive at the time. So like they tried to put these women in positions of power. They just weren't allowed to do much more than have like this side character the main hero had to answer to from time to time being the character. This was also the advent kind of start of the female versions of male heroes trope, where we got Batwoman and Supergirl, and those are the big two that came out that started the trope.
Their defining characteristic being that they were a woman.
They were a woman. Yes. They were typically weaker than the main hero, went on more women-focused stories when they went out solo, and typically existed to mess up, get caught, and have the hero rescue them later. Super not great. The Silver Age is defined a lot of the time by the birth of Marvel. Atlas Comics becomes Marvel Comics in 1961, and is launched with the Fantastic Four under its new name, a superhero family that included a woman among its ranks on the team from the very beginning, Sue Storm, the Invisible Girl. It's still not perfect. It's not great, but Sue could only turn invisible. She didn't have any like offensive type powers,
right?
And still often fell into the damsel in distress role, needed to be saved by her male companions.
I think I vaguely remember we brought this up maybe last time we did this, but because you had mentioned the force field powers thing that was retconned later, right?
Yes, and I
believe so.
That comes up later on.
Gotcha.
But yeah, she frequently did the like mother and wife thing, and the like, man, I wish I could give up superheroing to raise a child, and just a lot of like, I better turn invisible to hide from the enemy. Oh, I got hit in the head and I'm unconscious now. Like, just a lot of that. It's not great.
Yikes.
Marvel would then introduce the X-Men 2 years later, which also included a woman in their initial lineup, which was Marvel Girl. Marvel Girl was better written than Sue Storm in some aspects, but was still did a lot of the same. Ended up as damsel in distress. This takes us into the Bronze Age, which is like the mid 70s into the late 80s, early 90s. This saw an increase of social awareness among comic book authors. This is kind of the big, like, huge heyday of comics where you get there's just books on books, teams on teams, powers on powers, etc. Because the authors were trying, we did see more standalone women characters, changes to these characters to make them more distinct and more equal in power and agency to their male counterparts. We saw more heroes of color. Just in general, more representation was coming out in the characters of the books. They all were still written predominantly by white men. So it's getting better. It's still not perfect. One author who gets a lot of credit for this push forward at this time is Chris Claremont, a writer for X-Men in the 70s. He's so influential. There was a term that came up in my research called Claremont women, where, like, he wrote this type of woman that, like, Jean Grey became Rogue, Storm, Emma Frost, Kitty Pryde are all kind of these Claremont women that are they're smart, they're powerful, they stand up to men, and for the first time since the Golden Age, we have women kind of like jockeying back into some top spots in comic books again.
Which is I mean, just by definition, things you've shared, some of my favorite characters watching the cartoons growing up are the women of the X-Men.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like, we all dunk on Cyclops, but, like, I mean...
No, we all dunk on Beast now.
Beast is the one in the
Beast
kicking
is the
circle.
new dunk recipient.
But, I mean, looking back on the 90s era X-Men, I loved Rogue.
Yeah.
Like, incredible. So good.
Yeah. This is in kind of contrast to DC. DC was doing more of the just, like, woman version of the male character, of the male hero. They might get their own story, and we'll get into some of those stories here once I wrap the X-Men up. But the Marvel was doing a lot of the, like, heavy lifting in terms of moving things forward, getting the ball rolling forward again. We had things like Jean Grey went from being called Marvel Girl to becoming Phoenix, who's like this near omnipotent power. Sue Storm changed her moniker to Invisible Woman, became more self-assertive, a little more independent of Reed. And this is where the force field powers are kind of added to her repertoire as well. So she's able to do more than just, like, vanish out of sight when things get hairy. Storm, Aurora Monroe, that character in general was, a black woman, had very powerful powers, was a very prominent member of the X-Men. And that we also see, like, Emma Frost, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, and Psylocke, all under this kind of umbrella of Claremont women on the Marvel side. DC sees some separation of female characters from the male counterpart. Supergirl became Power Girl in this era. Batwoman got a whole origin story of becoming the Oracle in Alan Moore's The Killing Joke. Unfortunately, this follows the trend of women characters needing to go through some kind of trauma to complete their self-actualization,
to complete Bruce Wayne's self-actualization,
and to complete another character's self-actualization as part of their own. Yeah. We also see an increased trend of sexualization of these female characters. Many of the trends in female characters at this time come from the male authors' understanding of the women's liberation movement, which the women's liberation movement did include some amount of a woman's ownership of her expression of her sexuality as one of her like rights and ability, like, you know, tools she has as a woman to exert in the world. This unfortunately was often understood by white men at the time as empowered women have a lot of promiscuous sex and are hot, and that's what was reflected in the comics. So that began in the late 70s as well.
So does that mean, Kyle, we're going to talk about boob windows?
The boob windows are coming up, Andrew.
Oh boy.
It kills me. Like, this is another moment, like Todd had pointed out earlier, where they're always so close, but at the same time, so embarrassing far away.
Well, and you
just
see
fumble
this,
at the 6-yard line.
Yeah,
and you see this, like, I don't have data to back this up, but this intentional misinterpretation of what the women's liberation movement was trying to convey. Like, this is a lot of like, maybe not necessarily for each and every one of these specific authors, but like from the higher ups above them, it was an intentional misinterpretation of that concept. Into,
I mean,
women want to be sexy, we'll make them sexy. Like,
there's a lot of connections to video games, because like we all talk about video games, and like that video games were 30 years trending after this stuff. So like this happens in every, genre, but like that's the downfall of, like, they still have to make money, and the stats don't lie, right? So if 65% of your audience are teenage boys, money talks, and money says have the boob window, but then that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because it completely like blocks out an entire audience. So that's why 65% of your audience are teenage boys, because it's just
because you're chasing specifically chasing them,
because you're chasing that,
right?
It's all got the energy of like the shitty execs upstairs. Like someone kicks the door and is like, "Did you hear what progressive nonsense they're doing down in B Wing? Let's go get them." Like, we hear you're empowering women, huh? Oh, we'll show you.
We can't have that.
Says our rainbow-colored Twitter profile.
Right. Man. It feels bad.
I'm so
feels
angry.
real bad. All right, so from there we move into what is called the modern age of comics. This loosely began in the mid-90s and is defined by fan influence and therefore more fan ownership of the characters. You can see a similar trend in music, where like rather than chasing one big hit that's going to connect with the entire population all at once, more and more creators were aiming for a very specific niche and trying to tap into more niche interests. So comic book authors were no longer writing a few major titles aimed at the masses, but many smaller titles that were aimed at more specific markets. And fans had more open communication and more sway over characters they liked, because this was also the advent of like the internet, and like authors would go on these fan forums and like see what people liked about their characters and wrote more of that, rather than like wait 6 months for letters to the editor to come in and start reacting long after the story's half written. Things do get more iffy representation-wise, as there was an increased incentive to target female readers because you were chasing smaller demographics you hadn't previously reached, but pressure from above, from the people who really make the money, to use sex to sell titles. So you get these characters that are meant to be these like female power icons that also have hypersexualized designs. Andrew, this is where your boob window comes in. This is
the reign of Rob Liefeld.
This is where Rob Liefeld and Joss Whedon, two sides of the same coin of this era, really come into play.
Man, how uncomfortably true that is.
Yeah. So for those of you,
one is just more defiantly vascular than the other.
Yeah, Rob Liefeld was a very popular 90s comic artist who drew all of his characters just in this like hyper defined way. So all the men,
Todd, throw the Captain America up there. You
throw
know
the
one I'm
Captain
talking
America
about.
in. All the men
It's the best one.
had muscles on top of their muscles and like a gigantic bulge in their crotch and
Captain America's neck
guns.
looks like Todd's thighs.
Yeah, more guns strapped to their
got
body
you.
than like a military outfit.
Like
Like
your body has room for.
and
This
and
is
the
the
female
one.
characters had waists that were smaller than their wrists and like were bent into these impossible
Yes.
poses so you could see
There he
their,
is.
yeah.
Our boy.
Yeah, we've got super chest day Captain America in the notes now. But the
I
female
didn't notice
characters-
that even his shield has balls. Like, what in the world?
He looks like there's an alien literally bursting out of his chest.
Yeah, he looks
But wait, there's more.
unhealthy and uncomfortable.
Yeah. Somebody
For those not
photoshopped
looking
it.
at our notes, which
It's
again,
like-
you can join, you can get access to over at patreon.com/debatethiscast and join hashtag Buttthwomp Nation. Get to work on that. We got an IRL version of Chris Evans blown up as Rob Liefeld's Captain
Yeah.
America in our notes.
Or I mean, you can Google it too.
I'm just gonna put this in our Patreon without any context.
Okay.
Right
No
now.
context. And then in
Yeah.
the spirit of equality here is one of Rob Liefeld's more famous female design characters. So this is Psylocke,
Yeah.
as drawn by Rob Liefeld, who is her body contorted in a way that you can see both her boobs and her ass at the same time.
I was
Yeah.
just gonna
And
say,
It's really
and
kinda-
most of that
kinda
ass is
ridiculous.
exposed.
yeah.
Yeah. I've been
Yeah.
going to the chiropractor for 4 weeks trying to fix the same problem.
That she's got the tiniest strip of purple in between
Yep.
the cheeks to denote that she's not just straight up naked.
She's-
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's Rob Liefeld representing the art of the time, and then you have Joss Whedon, who's also writing comics and TV shows during this time, doing the very I'm a woman, I can kick just as much ass as the men, but then I have to fix my nails afterwards type of feminism that was popular at the time, which is also really terrible and bad. So just a whole lot of bad during the 90s. The drive into more niche markets did prop up more independent comic book makers at this time, and we have and a lot of independent comic book makers take their cues from kind of the success of Tank Girl, which is a very popular early 90s comic that used that relied on like the punk aesthetic. She had short asymmetrical hair, dressed in kind of like chunkier clothing, and drove a tank, which is really badass.
Cool.
And
Sick.
This punk aesthetic would also filter its way into the big two to become the mold for your sometimes non-binary or your rejecting of the woman, of the male gaze type characters, which started to appear in comics as well. And then in 1999, we get the website Women in Refrigerators, which launched with Women in Refrigerators. So this this was a website launched with the objective of calling out how common it was in comic books for female superheroes to have sexual assault, serious injury, or losing their powers as a trope of their self-actualization, and how often women's trauma and death was only served the self-actualization of the male characters, like Andrew said earlier.
Which if you want to hear more about that, I know we did talk fairly extensively about that in our last outing of social justice,
In our social justice and comics episode.
Which we'll link in the show notes. I think we ultimately even put trigger warnings at the top of it because there's like heavy shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. The easy example that I always give is like Gwen Stacy. Gwen Stacy
Yeah.
only exists to die.
Yeah.
If you were curious, Women in Refrigerators still live. Still
Sure.
looks like it's 1999.
Sure.
Now that is awesome.
Yeah. This website, Women in Refrigerators, does begin kind of starts to transition things into the what I'm calling the current age. This wasn't a clearly defined age, but like we start to get some of that, like, hey, we as women and people of color and people of the LGBTQ community also want like comics, and we want to read more comics that aren't terrible, that don't have terrible representations of who we are in them. Women in Refrigerators really kicked that off by drawing attention to just how like male-focused comic books, straight white male-focused comic books had been up to that point, and starts this trend of like moving comics away from the male gaze, even slightly. So that will bring us into the current age, kind of loosely the late aughts to now. This is a less
Post MCU.
That's kind of where I defined the kickoff, was like, if you take where Iron Man comes out as the current age of comics, it's a pretty good idea. So while the movies themselves took some time to catch up with the ideas started in the books, the late aughts and early 2010s saw a significant increase in positive representation of women, non-binary, and trans authors and characters in comics. Kind of the leading force during this time in both Marvel, they wrote for both Marvel and DC, is Grant Morrison, who has since come out as non-binary. He was presenting male at the time, came out as non-binary more recently. And even before their coming out would include more gender non-conforming and non-binary characters in their books. Specifically when they wrote for the new X-Men, there were a lot of like these new X-Men that were like non-gender conforming or had androgynous designs, and even included, I think the Professor Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters even included moving beyond the gender binary as like one of their ultimate goals of like removing oppression. They recognized the gender binary was a system of oppression, like racism, like capitalism, and anything else in those stories.
It's probably worth adding as well that right around, I think it was the early 2000s, is when Marvel stopped paying attention to the Comics Code Authority.
Yes.
And it was the early 2010s when basically everyone else did as well.
Yeah. This era also sees kind of the subversion of more popular characters. So this is a time where a lot of long-standing characters like titles change hands. So you see like Jane Foster as Thor is during this era, which is going to be a major plot point in Thor: Love and Thunder coming up. We see Pepper Potts assuming the role of Iron Man after having been rescued for an arc or whatever, which is referenced in Iron Man 3, Spider-Man Homecoming, and Avengers Endgame. There's a lot of this going on. This is where we get the Captain America Hail Hydra arc. Just a lot of subversion of long-standing white heroes starts to change to start getting some fresh faces and new ideas into these stories.
This was probably the time when Miles Morales hit the scene as well.
Yeah, Miles Morales is during this era. There's a lot of great examples that I do not have in here just because of time.
Yeah,
Birds of Prey.
Birds of Prey, the all-female anti-hero team was introduced during this time. It's important to note, I don't know how important it is, but a trend during this time was that a quick way to telegraph that your comic was progressive was by having one of your characters be a lesbian. That is,
Huh.
yeah, it's both good and not good.
Looking at
Yeah.
you, X-Men.
Looking
We
at
see you.
Well,
We see you out there.
I didn't know we were going to talk about tokenism today, but here we are.
Well, it seems like it's one of those things where I don't want to assume any good intent for a corporation. Like, let me get that out there to start. And so I don't think that it's altruistic that they're like, oh, we'll have a lesbian couple. Like, that's really nice. I feel like someone was like, no. It'll be good if we have a lesbian couple. Like, it wasn't. It doesn't feel
both.
Authentic. And
like
things can both be bad and kind of good. But
the
still.
authors who want more representation get a quote unquote win because they are including this same-sex relationship.
While a CEO gets to pat themselves on the back.
The CEO gets to pat themselves on the back, but at the same time, like women and women relationships are much more palatable to mass audiences than male on male relationships, and then you always have the possibility. Now that we set up these two characters as lesbians, maybe we'll get to have a sexy centerfold image of them now, and so it's not great, guys.
Well, and again, like you said, women on women relationships are more palatable to the general audience. I think again, like the conception there is that that's more palatable to the largely male audience that they have at the time.
And I think we should not call. I don't think relationships is a good word. I think women on women sex was palatable.
Yeah, that's I 100%
It's not
agree.
like people at that time were interested in an LGBT story.
Nobody's reading for like sapphic love in these stories.
There was the beginning of the demand for that. This was a time where like more and more people were coming out as gay, and there was more and more push to include that. But we were also in the throes of until 2008 or 2012, same-sex marriage was not legal. So like, you had it was a very like give and take type of thing, and like most of those, they took a lot more than they gave. So,
I mean, I think it should be noted, like, even being able to say the word gay in popular culture, in mainstream culture, is younger than any of us are.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Right, because like we were all alive when Ellen was canceled when she came out. You know what I mean? Not the TV show, because she was canceled because she's apparently a monster. But like, or not like the sitcom, right?
Yes.
That's how you measure society in in duration of history of like, well, how many times of Ellen's cancellation have you been alive for?
How many? Yeah. You just ask somebody, how many times has Ellen been canceled?
What do you know Ellen is canceled for?
If the answer is 2, you remember 9/11. Anyway,
this is the example I gave Todd off air, was that this was the same time that like Family Guy was considered mildly progressive when it told a gay joke because it said gay on TV. This was a time when the character on South Park, Big Gay Al, was considered progressive because they called him Big Gay Al. Like,
and he had Big Gay Al's Big Gay Animal Sanctuary.
Yep.
Yeah.
And like we've come a long way in a short amount of time.
We've come a long way.
But this, like, it is important to note that like at this time we were so regressed in this area that like you couldn't say gay on a show rated for anything less than TVMA or rated R a lot of times. If you included that, your show was for adults only. So that's why I say, like, yes, obviously this was woman on woman sexual relationships intended for the male gaze, but it was also the very first chance that gay characters were portrayed regularly in a medium. So that's where we were. With that, we're going to take a quick break.
Hey, Deja, what if we started a podcast?
But if we did that, we'd have to be an incredible hosting duo.
And both hosts would need a background in studying media, right?
Yeah, plus hot takes and passion that goes well past academics.
Well, what would we call it?
Welcome to Screen Studies with Deja and Justin. I'm Deja.
And I'm Justin.
This is the podcast where we talk about how the things on our screens affect our culture.
And how our culture affects what's on our screen.
Whether you're seeking conversations on TV, movies, or social media,
you can find new episodes of Screen Studies every Monday on Spotify and on the Apple Podcasts.
Okay, we're back. I would be remiss to do an episode on gender in comics without talking about non-binary and trans representation in comics. In the big two specifically, there isn't a lot to work with, and if there's more to work with, I had a hard time finding it. So if you listen to this and are like, Kyle, you forgot this major thing, this great example, please let me know. I would love to hear about it. Because I had a hard time researching this topic and getting more than a handful of names, and of those names, only a smaller representation of them wrote more than one or two comics. For
an issue
properties.
of a book.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll start with some authors. In both DC and Marvel, I brought up earlier, we have Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison, again, recently, I think 2020, 2019, around that time, came out as non-binary. Grant Morrison wrote long stretches of Batman, Superman, and Justice League comics in the early to mid 2000s, and was the executive producer for most, if not all, of the Arrowverse properties, starting with Arrow, The Flash, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow. I'm sure there's two other shows in that lineup.
Some of those things are very good.
Yeah, they are. They're all on the CW. They're all wrapping up right now.
And some are starring in alleged kidnappers.
Yeah, and some of them are not good.
Not that Flash. Different Flash.
Yeah, not that. Different
okay,
Flash.
Yeah, different Flash.
Grant Gustin is fine still.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
I'm
But
so sorry, Grant Gustin.
Different Grant Morrison also wrote Doom Patrol, which is
Yes.
also a DC thing
Oh,
doing very well
yeah.
these days. That does not involve an alleged kidnapper.
Nope.
Do you think
It's so
that,
easy to not be an alleged kidnapper, you guys.
what are the odds that if the Flash movie comes out, that the last scene is just Grant, what's his
Gustin?
That Grant Gustin just shows up as the new Flash and they never pretend anything happened ever?
I think Grant Gustin has been hinting for
million-dollar
years
idea.
that he is very done portraying Flash. I think he's ready. He's been doing it for close to a decade now and is ready to move on.
Oh my god.
So Grant Morrison is also wrote a multi-year stretch of new X-Men for Marvel. So they've got their hands kind of in both of the big two. They have been in the comics industry for 20 plus years. They you can see evidence of them working through their gender identity through issues of the comics, and due to them working through some of those issues and the language available to us at the times and the times they were writing in, not all of those expressions of gender identity are super great. There are missteps along the way. Grant would be the first to acknowledge and apologize for those, but they are important to bring up because of their influence on the last 20 years of comic books. Also, writing for DC, we have Zoe Quinn of Gamergate fame, who wrote several issues of the series Goddess Mode. Marvel has author Crystal Frazier, who is about to launch an arc of Gamma Flight. Is a trans author. She also wrote for the new Dune movie. She was a writer on Dune. So, big players writing for Marvel and DC still today. And then some characters. We in DC, a big one that I talked about it when we did the Sandman flavor text. Desire, one of the 7 Endless from the Sandman series, is canonically non-binary, first appearing in 1989 as a non-binary character. Neil Gaiman has insisted on the character's first androgyny at the time and then later non-binary status as our lexicon kind of evolved, and has insisted on casting a non-binary actor in the role for the upcoming Netflix project. So that character's identity as non-binary is very important to the author.
That's cool.
Yeah,
That is cool.
Gaiman is also typically credited with the trend in DC Comics for its angelic characters to be non-binary, although the term used initially is sexless, because the angels are beyond such
Have
human
transcended
trappings,
gender. Yeah, sure.
as gender. This is how he wrote the angels in the Sandman series, and DC more or less has continued that trend today. Another interesting thing I found, and I don't think Gaiman created the character, but did write Constantine, John Constantine, the character, for a while. John Constantine is one of the first bisexual characters in comics, first revealing himself to be bisexual in 1992. So Neil Gaiman, again, not perfect. Part of that is because he's a cishet white man, and part of that is because of the times he was written. Has made missteps along the way, and again, we would be the first to acknowledge that. But an attempt, a solid attempt by a major property to include non-binary and trans characters in their works. Another good one from DC, Matt, we've brought up before. Why don't you talk about Danny the Street, Matt?
Oh, I'd love to talk about Danny the Street.
Hopefully you listeners have been here for an hour just to get your Danny the Street Type 5.
My favorite sentient, non-binary geographical location, Danny the Street. Danny the Street was created, actually, maybe now that we've talked about it, knowing that Grant Morrison wrote Doom Patrol, they might have been the one to create Danny the Street. That was kind of
that would feel right.
That was under list of characters created of Grant Morrison was Danny the Street. So
excellent. Yeah. So Danny the Street is literally a sentient block of street. Usually they're a sentient block of street. Sometimes they're bricks. Sometimes they're a world. Sometimes they're an amusement park. We did a whole episode about it. Not directly Danny the Street, but we talked about them a lot, and we can probably link that in the show notes. But in general, Danny the Street is this kind of like, I don't know, cosmic being that exists as a sentient street with shops and people who live there, and is canonically non-binary, uses they them pronouns, and communicates through like street signs and stuff. And one of the initial really defining characteristics of Danny the Street in the art was this mix between hyper masculine storefronts with hyper feminine design
Dressings.
and art. Yeah. So, you know, Danny the Street had a guns and surplus store that was covered in pink flowers with cursive writing, and was really just a way to put gender fuckery in comics, but also is a street. I just really like Danny the Street.
Location. I think you brought up in the episode where we first talked about Danny the Street too. One of the things they showed in the comics was like Danny the Street was very, very welcoming to anyone outcast specifically because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and was very welcoming to people, you know, not welcome at their homes because of who they are. Which again feels a lot like Grant Morrison working through some things, but is also very, very cool. A very cool character
for sure. As a sentient location, there are people that live within unclear live with Danny the Street and move around as Danny the Street moves around, and yeah, those people are largely outcasts who have found homes again within. Danny,
I don't like in. I don't like that one.
Language is failing us in this context, and we
Mhm.
haven't evolved
With.
our language to
The correct preposition is with.
it's
Okay.
it's with or within for sure.
yeah. And then the last character I wanted to talk about on the DC side is a trans character. Nia Nal, or Dreamer is her superhero alias. And she is specifically from the Arrowverse show Supergirl. She has since appeared in comics, but it's been like a Easter egg for fans of the show. She hasn't had like her own run or anything in the comic. She does like astral projection and telepathy, and like if you can associate a power with dreaming, she does it in some capacity in the show. This is a rare example in the big two of a trans character that is not a side character. She is a major player in Supergirl once she comes onto the scene, and has an origin story that is incredibly trans affirming. Her powers are hereditary through the women in her family, so it's like one of those like your grandmother, my mother, and her mother before all had this power. There's always been a dreamer in the world, and her origin story specifically involves her like accepting her trans identity and then getting the powers of her mother when she does so, like affirming her womanhood. So it's very cool.
Wikipedia says that Nia Nal is the first transgender superhero on television.
Okay.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah,
great. I saw that, and I'm hesitant to throw around absolute terms like first without doing more research, and I didn't do more research. So
well,
thank you,
and what I do want to say is that this is perhaps the only good thing that came from Supergirl, the TV show.
I know fans of
Is that a hot
the
take?
TV show.
Is that a hot take? It might be a hot take.
Oh, okay. Full disclosure. I watched the pilot and I could not run fast enough. So maybe it did get better.
I know it got better after the first season from the fan I know, who is Derek Harper, my brother.
Oh, okay. Well, I respect friend of the show Derek Harper. I retract my statement until further research is done.
So on the Marvel side of things, Marvel has had a slightly longer history of non-binary verbiage among their characters. Shapeshifters like Mystique, Raven Darkholme, and I think this is Zavin from The Runaways tend to make commentary.
It is Zavin.
Zavin, great. Tend to make commentary on the fluid nature of gender as shapeshifters because they can change their sex. Although in these portrayals, they do tie gender to sex, and the fluidity of gender is tied to their specific fluidity of sex as well, which is a now more outdated understanding of gender and sex. But these Marvel was trying with these characters, and this is again where these missteps kind of happen. Loki has also famously been portrayed as a non-binary or gender fluid character for the last 20 years or so, including an Easter egg in the Disney Plus show. And has done a better job more recently at separating their sex from their gender than others, but again, isn't 100% perfect, again, because our understanding of that is still changing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make. There's something I just thought of when you said that. Like, our understanding as a society has changed and changed dramatically even in the last 10 years. I mean, we have language now that we didn't have, again, post MCU. Like when Iron Man came out, which apparently is a Nexus event of its own. We went from like, in that span of time, we went from like, do you know how I know you're gay in 40-Year-Old Virgin to like having all this language and the idea of just like casually using pronouns in everyday language, despite what some older coworkers might disagree with. I think it should be stated that a lot of the stuff does come with sometimes good intentions, but sometimes maybe an element of its time, or maybe like, yeah, you didn't do the research.
Yes, and there are certainly cases more recently where like element of its time isn't appropriate anymore. Like we can't say like tying a character who's like, gender is binary, non-binary because I can grow and lose a penis at any moment in time. Like that is now an outdated mode of thought,
sucks.
right? But
Yeah.
in the 80s when Mystique was saying things like that, that was a new understanding at the time, and like we like you said, just didn't have the understanding we do now to like fully grok that. But it was an attempt, and I think it should be like, again, this cis white male thinks it should be recognized as a positive push forward from the time. I don't have specific names for this section, but I remember when I was reading New X-Men, Morrison included non-binary classmates in Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, and included the movement past the gender binary as one of the ultimate goals of, I think, both the Brotherhood of Mutants and Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. Like, because Magneto's whole thing during that era was more a mutant revolution, but that revolution pushing people past oppressive systems, which they recognized the gender binary as one such. And then another one that kept coming up in my research from Marvel is in 2011, they introduced the character Hydra Queen. Currently, the leader of Hydra is a trans woman, canonically a trans woman, although it's not explicitly stated in the comics. It's very clearly implied through both the character design and like context clues they leave. It seems to be one of the few villains where their trans identity is not like a part of their villainy. Again, because it's not like specifically called out. There's this long history of villains having gay affectations to clue the reader or listener or viewer in on the fact that like this is a villain. Look how flamboyant they're acting. It doesn't seem the case here. However, this is very also controversial because in the comics, Hydra are 100% absolutely Nazis. You don't have this like separation from Nazism that you do in the MCU. And Nazis didn't do good things to trans people.
Nazis don't like trans people. You can just say it that way.
Yeah, that's not a hot take.
Yeah. So like it exists. It's in Marvel. It's a thing. I don't know what to do with this because it's not my call to make. It's a super comic book way of doing things though, and it's almost, to me, feels too stupid to criticize.
Could you say they were so close?
So close, guys. Yeah, that's what I found. As far as this goes, anyone got anything? Did this ring any bells for anyone, or just something you've like been holding on to for a while you wanted to talk about? Now's your chance.
Cool. I have two things. Thing one is, you mentioned Zavin earlier from the Runaways. Zavin is included in the Runaways TV show and is non-binary, transcends gender. Zavin is an alien that can change how they look. So, take that for what it's worth. But in the show, and I'm not super familiar with the run of the book that Zavin is introduced in, but in the show for Runaways, Zavin is betrothed to another character. That character's name is Carolina. When we meet Zavin in the show, Zavin is presenting as traditionally male, but Carolina is in a sapphic relationship with another woman on the team, And so Zavin does is this form not pleasing to you? And, does a shapeshift. So again, it's close. But the other cool thing that I really wanted to talk about way back when you were talking about the golden age of comics and you were talking about like Millie the Model and your early era romance novels.
Tina the Typist.
Yeah, whatever other
The Thrilling Adventures of Tina the Typist.
Name and Job, the movie. So one of the characters from that era is Patsy Walker, famously of Miss America teen comics from the 40s, and then Patsy and Her Pals and Patsy and Hetty, which were the two spin-off comics. So Miss America teen comics was published by Timely Comics, which then became Atlas Comics, which then became Marvel Comics. And Patsy Walker's series were run continuously through 1967. And why that's cool is because after 1967, Marvel took the same character, Patsy Walker, and transformed her into Hellcat and made her a superhero that they continued to use through the Defenders and wrote it as her character. The storybooks, like the Patsy and Hetty and Patsy and Her Pals and the early books, were canonized as comic books written by Patsy's mother, Dorothy, to sell the story of her daughter's American life.
Oh, cool.
If this sounds really familiar to you, Patsy Walker is known a little bit better as Trish Walker from the Jessica Jones Netflix show, portrayed by Rachel Taylor. And that's the same character. It's an incredibly similar story. The way that she's used is very similar, but Hellcat's a really cool character. She gets kind of shafted in season 3 of Jessica Jones and Netflix, but Hellcat as a character is really cool and is, I believe, if I remember correctly, the only character from the golden age of comics that Marvel has printed continuously as the same character.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really neat.
That is very neat.
I made a joke at the beginning of this that nobody reads anymore, and one of the things that I've been trying to do this year to improve myself is to read. And I actually have a book recommendation, which is it's not a comic book, it's just a book-ass book. But listeners out there, if you are interested in the idea of women just not being represented in life, in anything, a really good book it's called Invisible Women. The full title is Invisible Women Exposing Data. God damn it. Invisible Women Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. It's a really good book. It talks a lot about how our society operates to the disadvantage of women. And I think that the tight 30 on that is men are not intentionally trying to disadvantage women and people of color. It's that white men are predisposed to give advantage to themselves and disadvantage to other people because they do not.
Because we have dumb monkey
consider.
brains. Yeah,
we've done monkey brains, but it's the fact of negligence, right?
Yeah,
we as good intention, and I say that because at the end of the day, as good as those intentions might be, we still will fall flat when we are trying to write perspectives that are not our own.
Yes.
And I say that because I want to then dovetail this into talk about Miss Marvel, which is a very relevant thing that's happening right now. Quite literally, as of this recording, we are about to see episode 2 of the show. And Miss Marvel is an example of a Pakistani American superhero written by a female Pakistani American writer, created by.
Oh.
And I think there is a distinct difference, a coat of polish, if you will, when that kind of writer, somebody who has actually had those experiences, is able to create and write freely that character and use that voice. There's a reason why the Moon Knight show whipped so hard and was such a good representation of Egyptian culture for the same reason. And why the Miss Marvel show, again, we've only seen one episode to this at the point of this recording, but like why that feels so representative without Miss Marvel's powers being, I don't know, the power of
Pakistan.
whatever.
Careful.
Yeah,
Careful.
I don't want to say any. I don't want to even say anything as a joke. You know.
Yeah.
Like kind of like you mean like I'm sorry, but like Black Panther, right? Like
Yeah.
Black Panther has the power of Africa. You know.
Yeah.
And like he was written that way. Yeah, that movie was a really good adaptation and changed that a little bit. But like Black Panther's superpower is Africa. So how do you take a character and represent her diversity without making it a thing, like without making her identity that? Well, you do so because you have somebody who has had those experiences and can write I can naturally retell that story and have her powers be super stretchy arms, and it's fine.
Yeah. That's
Right. I mean, yeah, I think all of these moments that we talked about that we were like, they were so close. I mean, this is, I'm certainly not the first person to say this, and I don't want to come off as such, but all of those things could have been fixed by having someone in the room, you know?
Right.
Like, if
Right.
this isn't a room of cishet white dudes, maybe some of these problems start to get better. And at the end of the day, I think the real message there is just how important representation is, not only in the media that you create, but in the people who you let create that media. Because as much as I consider myself to be an ally, like, I'm not going to sit down and write a queer Black trans person story in a way that is going to be in any way sincere or even necessarily relatable, because that's not the life experience that I've had.
Right. And you'll try. You'll do the research. You'll put in all the effort. But at the end of the day, it's still going to fall flat because you did not have that experience.
I think that we can like tie this all back to the origin of comics. Like you have like things like the X-Men work well as a tale of prejudice because Stan Lee, a Jewish man, wrote his experiences with that into the X-Men. Now they aren't the X-Men aren't Jewish, or the ones that are. It's not a central.
Nor
facet
did
of the
Stan
character.
Lee grow up fighting giant robots. But
Correct.
Yeah,
we get the point. Yeah,
but the interactions, the mutant characters who society looks down upon, reflect his experiences as a Jewish man. Like it is better when people are able to write about their experiences and not try and write about experiences they think they can. Yes.
Yep.
With that, I want to close us out on I hope something fun. I hope people are able to laugh with recognize we are laughing with you at these times.
The capitalist machine.
The capitalist machine tried to be inclusive and did in fact just whiff so hard. All we can do is laugh at it, because otherwise we would be sad all the time. And I have two examples of this. If you guys, if any come to mind, please feel free to share them afterwards. And my first one is actually also a Miss Marvel point, but it's the first Miss Marvel who was white and blonde and written in the 70s. Miss Marvel was a early character in the Silver Age, adopted by feminists at the time. She was Miss Marvel. She wasn't Supergirl. She was a woman on her own fighting crime. And Marvel, in an attempt to add what they thought would be a woman-specific story, had an arc where Miss Marvel was raped, accosted for wanting to abort the pregnancy that resulted of that, fell in love with her rapist, and moved in and raised the baby with her rapist. And this was all in an attempt to write a realistic, woman-specific story. And judging by the looks on all of your faces, I see you all understand how poorly they did in realizing that.
Yeah, that was...
Yikes.
They missed all of the marks. Not even close.
I'm pretty sure we talked about that one when we last bridged this topic of just like how terrible. And like years later, they revisited the topic.
Yes.
And like, you know, Ms. Marvel like got to like
they did a little better.
Everyone.
Yeah.
But like, yeah.
But that's saying it was rough.
Yeah, it's a big heckin' yikes.
It's real bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is emblematic of like the fridging example. It's one of the earlier cases of just like, here's a woman character, we're gonna put her through some trauma and have some self-actualization come out on the other side.
Plot.
That's the plot. It's just one of the most egregious examples of that. Easily. The other one I have is, and I have an image of it here in our notes. In 2007, Sideshow Collectibles released a 14-inch statuette of Mary Jane hand-washing Peter Parker's Spider-Man costume. Again,
which is, mind you, let's stop there. That description alone is already like
that's all you need.
Pretty not great, but then it gets worse.
This was all in an attempt to create more female collectibles. Has Mary Jane like bent over at the waist, thong straps like popping out of her low-rise jeans, boobs hanging out of her shirt, like
big Rob Liefeld energy.
No, you know what this is? It's the Megan Fox in Transformers pose.
It's the Megan Fox in Transformers
pose. Yes.
Same
was
year.
that the same?
It's same year.
It's
It's verbatim that pose.
Yeah. Happily like scrubbing Spider-Man's uniform in a bucket of suds. Like it's again as bad as it sounds. There's zero redeeming qualities about this statue. And it was sold and pushed in 2007 once again.
So I looked once I saw that you put this in here. So it was a limited run and there were only so many of these collectibles made. And you can currently bid for it on eBay for anywhere between $700 to $1,200.
Hell yeah.
If you really got to have this.
Smash
it's one of those things that like looking at it in 2000, geez, yeah, wow, it's
identical.
It is the Megan
they just
Fox.
put the Megan Fox pose in our show notes, and yeah, I mean it is like graphically the same,
copy paste.
But who did they make this for? Like who
Weird horny nerds, Matt. Like
but who did Toy Designer.llc wake up and like who at that company was like, I know what the kids want.
Well,
they want a laundry action figure.
What they did, Matt, is they had the dry erase board and it said kids with a bunch of circles around it and then horny with a bunch of circles around it.
Yeah.
And they step back and they go,
They drew a line between those two and someone was like, that line is shaped like Megan Fox. What if we did that?
I mean, and I don't think the collectibles, the statuette collectibles market is aimed at kids either, because these things at launch are $200-$300 a lot of times.
Yeah,
too.
fair.
These are aimed at the whales, which are weird horny nerds. Like, yeah.
So I've got one to add that's lighter. So if you are,
it's just different.
It's different. Well, so the way that I found out about it is if you consume dropout media, college humor's, transformation, there's a show called Actually, and Actually introduced they did a whole, because what they do is they like present a situation and you have to like pick out what's wrong about it. And they discussed pink kryptonite. So there is a run of I think it was a Supergirl comic where Superman is exposed to pink kryptonite, which pink kryptonite turns people gay.
Turns
That is
Kryptonians gay.
Kryptonians gay specifically.
God.
That
Sucks so bad.
It sucks so bad, and it sucks worse because reasons that are forthcoming. So when Superman is exposed to it, he becomes gay, and it is telegraphed that he is gay because he is attracted to Jimmy Olsen, which is like not an adult. And he makes commentary on window treatments, which is a bad stereotype. Now, here's the kicker, everyone listening at home. You get to play along as well. What year do you think this comic came out?
That's what I was looking up. I know it's
don't. If you look it up, don't say it.
I know it's.
I don't want to know.
And I know it's more recent than we all want it to be.
It's a number that's higher than I want it to be. Yeah.
Okay, so it was 2012 that they legalized gay marriage, right?
I'll tell you it was before then.
Oh, okay. It was before. I was going to say that this was in response to try and capture the gay audience. I'll say 2010.
It was 2003, which is still too recent.
Way too recent.
Way too recent. Yeah. So pink kryptonite. I don't know who thought that would just be a thing, but it is.
Again, that's right in that. That's right in that era of like, look, we acknowledged gay people are real. That's progressive, right? Like,
yeah.
And
we did it.
The way so I'm pretty sure the rest of the world has recently found out about this due to that show. Actually, and the way it works is they'll read a statement and they have to buzz in and say actually, and then they correct them. And what's funny is they read this out and he's like, no, like pink kryptonite's not the thing that's wrong about that statement. And Brennan Lee Mulligan buzzes in and goes, actually that's offensive. and then he tells them the rest of the story and they're like, actually that's incredibly offensive.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
Matt, Andrew, any good missteps? Any fun goofs?
There are no good missteps. They're all they're all bad. And it's the only good is that I think they're becoming less frequent in major stories as they become more responsible and more as we've said, as they become more inclusive in their writers and their designers and ideally the people making the decisions. Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to do a tight 30 on She-Hulk. And I'm going to pose a question because I don't know a lot about She-Hulk, but what I do know is that She-Hulk's pitch is Hulk but lady.
Yep.
But 2, She-Hulk has always been like just green lady and not
just
like
green,
strong, but green lady.
Just green strong lady, not like ravaging idiot like the Hulk.
Right.
She's been bigger and smaller, but she's always like smart lady.
Woman must be woman. Now I know that the character, like, she's a lawyer and it's like kind of this like funny thing and like that's fine. But we haven't seen as this recording, we haven't really seen a lot out of She-Hulk's side short of like 1 minute teaser trailer, which that show's coming later this year. But there was a lot of news reports surfacing that when they originally did the SFX for the
She-Hulk
general
show.
The greening her out, right? They were told by Disney to tone down the physicality, which like really bums me out.
Super bummer.
Yeah big bummer.
Yeah, especially because like I feel like their last couple shows have been really inclusive and progressive and trying to push this forward, and I don't know, that just really bummed me out. I don't have a lot of expectations going in that show, so we'll see what that ultimately becomes. But I'm curious. I mean, do any of y'all have a lot of history with She-Hulk?
I know that. So she has had varying levels of power as well. I'm sure there's probably a storyline where she's been giant punching Hulk-like design, but I
Sure.
know that she has gone through like any hero, like power-ups, power-downs. And so I don't know. I'm also very bummed if there's any truth to like they tone down the muscle on the punching green
Yeah.
lawyer. And I'm hopeful that they would ease out of that. I mean, it's not like they can't fix that in some way, shape, or form, but I don't give me slightly larger woman
Yeah.
Right.
lawyer who's green. Like, give me if she's got Hulk blood, like just do
Make
it.
her Luisa. I mean, Disney's already learned the
Yeah.
lesson from
Right?
Encanto.
Right.
Luisa was an incredibly popular character.
Mhm.
Like, we have the receipts now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm hoping it's
Disney has the receipts now.
I'm hoping it something similar to the Sonic movie happens, where the fans bully Disney
Yeah.
Bully them.
into giving Jessica Walker
Doing
what's
right.
Let's get
some
the
bigger
vascular
biceps.
cut.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't want to defend Disney. That's not what I'm here for. So I don't know, call it hopium, I guess. But my understanding of She-Hulk, which again, like I don't have a ton of background on, is that She-Hulk as a character, at least in her more modern stories, and again, I have not done the research to back this shit up, so feel free to tell me that I'm wrong. But my
Right.
understanding is that She-Hulk as a character in her more modern books acts as kind of a satire to this like idea of a female superhero, because my understanding is that She-Hulk fucks, that like She-Hulk is over sexualized as a commentary, and then she uses like she embraces that sexuality. I am not researched enough to like talk about it eloquently, so I'm not going to try. But
I get what you're
That
trying
is-
to convey, like, because there was a period of time where She-Hulk was like she was a superhero, and then her day job was like she did the Ally McBeal thing of like a woman wanting it all kind of thing. And I can easily see now how here in 2022 current She-Hulk is written as a spin on that, where like she is getting it all. Like it's not a struggle, she's just crushing it because she's She-Hulk.
Yeah.
So I could see
and
that.
so like
But I don't know how. I again haven't done the research. So
right, yeah. So I don't want to like, you know, hop up on a high horse and tell you that like it's all okay because that, but I do think that there's some background there. The other thing I will say that I've kind of, again, I'll call it hopium. The hopium that I'm huffing is that the VFX changes to She-Hulk were to avoid the uncanny valley, because I think that She-Hulk is the character so far in the MCU that is the closest to the uncanny valley, unless somebody else has another example, because
maybe Hulk
she is
Ruffalo, but
like
that's a
maybe
little-
Smart Hulk, but
Yeah.
he's so blown out in proportion, and She-Hulk in most of her comic books is not super massive. And so like I'm afraid.
But then do the Gandalf camera trick, right? Like
Yeah.
I mean, there is a playbook for that. Like that exists. I don't know.
Right.
We
And
don't
again,
need to
like
make a big deal about it. We haven't seen the show yet.
yeah, I am not trying to be an apologist for Disney, and I refuse to be labeled as such. But like, I think that early TV previews on shows with monster VFX budgets do not the final product show, and I'm withholding my judgment until
Totally fair.
August, I think is when that comes out.
Yeah, we will see then. All right.
Matt, did you want to talk about Black Widow's feet?
Yeah, no, I don't. You
made
baited
it
me
to the
into
ending
agreeing
just
with
to
you,
get-
Kyle.
We made it to the ending just to get the opener. Hell yeah.
God damn it. Yeah, the other thing that I did bring up that I wanted to talk about off the air was Scarlett Johansson's inclusion into the MCU and the way that Natasha Romanoff as a character was treated by Joss Whedon, and also Jon Favreau, but like lesser so Jon Favreau, mostly Joss Whedon. Starting with her introduction in Iron Man 2, which I think is a MCU movie that not a lot of people have rewatched recently. I think it's not the worst MCU movie, but I will say take the time to go back and watch the introduction of Scarlett Johansson as Tony's new assistant. And it's like they signed Scarlett Johansson up as a supermodel and were like, I guess we'll make you a superhero eventually.
Iron Man 2 is the one I see the starkest difference between the transition from Paramount to Disney. For a lot of the reasons you're saying and some others, but like that is the one that feels most like a Paramount movie and not a Disney movie of the early MCU canon.
For sure. I think that one and Incredible Hulk are the two that are like, this is pre-Disney for sure, but she was just a sex toy. I mean, that was like, I think probably why Scarlett Johansson was such a big cast at the time, because that was before Scarlett Johansson was the highest paid woman in Hollywood and was the newer hot thing on the block, being that was 2009, 2010. I think Iron Man 2 was 9. Okay,
because one was 2008.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was like pretty rough, and then Age of Ultron happened.
But even we know this story.
Yeah, even the first Avengers was very like, and she's also here. You know, like her inclusion, I think, really reeks of that Joss Whedonism that we already talked about earlier, which is like, yeah, I can kick ass, but I'm gonna be sexy while I do it. I think that early Black Widow had a lot in common with Pamela Anderson movie Barbara Wire. Barb Wire. It's a bad movie. It was that same, like, you know, sexy leather flips. And I'm glad that we got to see Scarlett Johansson and Natasha Romanoff evolve throughout the MCU. But I don't think that, like, you can point to anything pre-Endgame and say that her portrayal, not Scarlett Johansson,
Infinity War.
Civil
War. Pre-Civil War. She's
War.
Okay.
Okay. I would take that.
No, Winter Soldier, I would say.
Yeah, Winter Soldier is it. She is a prominent. She is the second lead in Winter Soldier.
I was cutting out Winter Soldier because there's still a non-zero amount of like, let me make out with you so that we can avoid this security guard.
They were definitely trying to find their feet on like giving her that like femme fatale.
Yeah, they were trying to do cool Born Identity woman.
Yeah, so like again, it got better, but I think that I am definitely guilty of this, and I think a lot of people are too, of saying that like, sure, Marvel's done some bad things, but look how good the MCU is.
Well,
and there are examples even in the modern day MCU that are less than stellar.
There's some additional. I mean, this is just a fun like bit. I know that. I will not apologize for what they did to Scarlett Johansson in Age of Ultron, but I also know that they were creative with some of her scenes because she was like multiple months pregnant during the filming of that movie.
Yeah.
So there's
which one?
Age of Ultron.
Huh.
And so like that's why like the bar scene, like you only see her from like the chest up.
Yeah.
Interesting.
There's multiple times that like her scenes are trimmed strange or she's at a certain perspective because like she was like 6 months pregnant. That does not excuse the damage done there. Just
no.
If there's one thing on Debate This that we do not do is apologize for Age of Ultron.
No.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for our gender in comics flavor text. Thank you again, Sharkbait, for commissioning that. And thank you, listeners, for listening to Debate This. You can follow along with the arguments on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Debate This Cast, or on our website at debatethiscast.com. And once more, if you want to commission your own flavor text, like what Sharkbait did here today, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/debatethiscast. Joining up at the $25 Master Debater level, you will have access to the post-show, the Google Docs, our monthly movie nights, and then after 3 months, you get to unlock your first flavor text episode. You also get to join our Discord and chat with us online. It's got a lot of perks, and we like money. Please subscribe to our Patreon.
Well, we don't like money. We like eating. Let's be honest. Like,
we like eating and
like
having our
food
rent
and
taken
shelter.
care of.
Well, I think what Kyle's really missing is if you subscribe and if you join our Patreon and you join the Discord, you get to see beefy pictures of Chris Evans as this souped up Captain America who's all
You
chest.
get to see
Kyle really
freakish
buried the
above-
lead. You're right,
Yeah.
Todd.
Yep. So that's gonna do it. Until next time, I'm Kyle Harper.
I'm Todd. If you thought Pink Kryptonite was bad in 2003, wait till they bring it back in 2017. Thomas.
I'm Matt, disinterested in talking about Scarlett Johansson's feet. Cole.
And I'm Andrew, unleash the swole cut Henderson.
And we are saying thanks for debating with us. And if you think we're wrong, you can come fight us behind the swing sets, nerds.